On the world today, we're going to discuss medicine and what is going on in Africa, but not just there, in other parts of the world too, and how privatized medicine is now dominating the field, except in a few oases that are still left, Cuba, Venezuela, etc. With me to discuss this is Professor Alison Pollock, one of the best-known public health scientists and experts in her field anywhere. She's just written a book, which is a brave book, tackling rugby, what every parent should know about injuries. But Alison, we'll discuss this some other time, no doubt. But let's talk about Ebola. What are its origins and how did it spread so quickly in these three countries?
Well, Ebola is a virus. Nobody quite knows what the origins are. Some think it might be from the bat. And it's spread through bodily fluids, so that's the important mechanism. In most normal situations, it should be very easily contained by quarantine and by isolation. But the big problem in the countries where it's most prevalent, which is Sierra, Liberia and Guinea, is that these are very, very poor countries where the infrastructure has increasingly been ripped out, especially in terms of health systems, and the virus is now in urban areas where there's close human contact. So it makes it very difficult to control and contain, especially when it's happening in areas where there's a lot of overcrowding and poverty and poor sanitation.
And the Western health community, so to speak, the World Health Organization, was slow to react, I felt, in terms of what could have been done at an early stage of this disease.
Well, I suppose the WHO was hoping, as in the previous large outbreak in the 1970s, that it would be fairly easily contained. Perhaps what happened was that they hadn't reckoned was the fact that these countries where it's emerging are actually among the very poorest countries. Liberia and Sierra Leone have been through their own long periods of civil war, conflict with displaced refugees, where the gross domestic product and the economy has very badly suffered. And what we've seen in all these countries is a real hollowing out of all sorts of public services, but especially health systems. So it's very, very difficult to contain it, and we've got real issues of poverty. So I suppose the first hope was that these would be fairly, the disease would be fairly easily contained. But actually, of course, it's a virus which has a very high case fatality rate. They say about 55% chance of dying if you contract the virus. So this is very serious. But one of the big problems is that the Western world, especially the US government, is coming back with solutions of guns and magic bullets. So we've been here before. The announcement by Obama that he's going to send in 3,000 troops, and the parallel announcement that they're going to focus on rapid vaccine production. And this is a complete removal from the social and structural determinants of public health, because the origins of all public health are in very simple and basic solutions. It's about clean water, sanitation, good nutrition, so the evils of poverty. And on top of that, you need very good health systems with proper doctors and nurses and facilities that you can isolate people, and you can also do what's called contact tracing. So you need to go back into the community to find out who the affected individuals have been in contact with, so that you can then quarantine and isolate those individuals to make sure that they actually then don't get the disease and then pass it on during the incubation period. All of that has been stripped out. This is what these countries are looking at. They've had a total erosion and collapse of their public healthcare systems, and this is the tragedy. So the population has very, very few doctors and nurses. They simply cannot cope. And of course, the public facilities that are there are overcrowded. They're in terrible conditions, and they're completely and utterly understaffed. So this problem of an epidemic was going to hit them. It could have been Ebola, it could be something else, it could be cholera, whatever. This was actually going to come home to hit these countries very hard indeed. This was entirely predictable, and it's been predictable for more than 20 years, and it's what the public health lobby and the public advocates have been talking about. The solution to these epidemics is not the magic bullets of vaccines, and it's not sending in the troops. It's structural, it's social, it's economic, it's environmental, and it's putting in all the public health measures.
But the entire world capitalist system as it functions is basically not in favor of public health services. They're in favor of privatized solutions, privatized facilities, which means that in most countries, increasingly, you have a 2- or 3-tier system. You have very good quality hospitals for the rich and people who can afford them. You have a 2nd tier for more middle-class people who also have to pay but not so much, and their facilities aren't so good. And then you have public hospitals, not just in Africa, but in countries like India and Pakistan and Sri Lanka, which are a total and complete disgrace, and nothing is done about it on a global level at all, because this is not a priority. I mean, it's just outrageous. Do you think, I mean, given that this is how the health system functions, from what you said, the obvious solution, medium term and long term, is to create a strong social infrastructure in these countries. But that's what the International Monetary Fund asked them not to spend money on, you know, over the last 4 decades. So what do you think they can do?
Well, I think you're raising important issues. What is the role of the IMF, the World Bank, the African Development Bank? Because again, if we look at Liberia and Sierra Leone and Guinea, which actually have a lot of natural resources, what's happening to these countries in terms of their economics is that increasingly the lands are being privatized and being occupied by foreign investors who are coming in, and they're simply stripping out the resource and the assets. Liberia has a GDP, gross domestic product, of a couple of $2 billion and a population of, you know, I think it's 5 or 6 million. So how are they meant to rebuild when you've got foreign directives coming in and public-private partnerships and great flows of money going out? And you don't have any mechanism for redistribution, because redistribution means you're trying to build a fairer society and you're trying to put the resources back in. So it starts with the economy, it starts with what's happening to the land, it starts with the fact that palm oil and cocoa and rubber are important cash crops, and this land and these ownership has been transferred. And I mean, this is very well documented by important organizations like Global Witness, but also the Oakland Foundation in the US, who have actually charted what's happening to the land. And remember, many of the farmers, for instance, in Liberia, 70% of the population live in rural areas. There'll be subsistence farmers. So this is an issue. When you have the population spending 80% of their money on food, and then you have all these cordons around them, then of course you've got a real problem, because the poverty is actually going to be accelerated in these countries because of the Ebola virus, because the borders are closing and because you don't even have economic flow anymore. So I think we need to start with the economics, because that's the cause of the structural problems. And then we've got the way in which the World Health Organization, which is the international global authority on health, it has the lawmaking powers, but it's systematically, over 20 years, it's been completely starved of funds, and as such funding as it gets are tied to all sorts of conditions, and those conditions are being set by large global NGOs such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which have no democratic basis, no accountability, and which in turn are doing untold harm through their vertical disease programs, because they are not rooted in public health and the public health systems. And a good example of a vertical disease program is when you take Ebola. and then you bring in your operation to tackle Ebola and you ignore all the other causes of disease such as TB or malaria, or poverty, malnutrition. At the same time, when you focus all the efforts of the industry on vaccine development. But actually vaccines are not what these countries need. It's proper redistribution and public health measures. And we learn nothing from history. That's what's so shocking. All the great reforms, all the great collapse of infectious disease epidemics was actually not down to drugs and vaccines. It was down to redistributive measures which included sanitation, nutrition, good housing, and actually above all, a real democratization. And with it came education and all the other measures that we need. Now, I'm not saying we don't need vaccines, but one of the big problems is that the vaccine development itself is now in the hands of these large, very powerful foundations like NGOs like Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccine Initiative, who in conjunction with big companies like GSK and Merck are out to seek patents. And the reason why they like vaccines is because vaccines mean mass immunization, it means numbers, and numbers mean money. And of course, all of this is being paid for by the West and Western governments when this money could much more easily flow into the governments themselves to rebuild their health systems. Because we're talking about rebuilding public health infrastructure, and that includes putting in community primary health care, community health systems, infection control units at community level, putting in hospitals and training nurses and doctors. And the other big problem in all of these countries is not just a brain drain because a few doctors and nurses are there, they want to leave, and that's happening also in Nigeria, or they want to work in the private sector, or they want to work for these NGOs because the money is much better. And so the whole public health system is completely hollowed out. And this is a real problem because the Gates Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates, do not believe in the public sector. They do not believe in a democratic, publicly owned, publicly accountable system.
So in fact, the WHO, because of governmental policies, and the priorities of the Washington Consensus, i.e. neoliberalism, is effectively defunct compared to what it used to do. Well, defunct in the sense that it can't do what needs to be done, shore up, strengthen, build, if necessary, in some of these countries, public health systems.
Well, there's a very important paper recently in the British Medical Journal, I think by David Legg, which actually sets out what's been happening to the WHO over 2 decades, where the US refused to give the funding that it should have done. And then what you have is when Western governments in the US come in, they tie it to conditionalities, which is usually around the Bill and Melinda Gates priorities and not around the essential public health priorities. And the WHO has its hands tied. And actually, it is the World Health Organization. It has got the law-making powers, and yet it has never exercised these functions. We're talking about democratic deficits that are happening when large global funds like the Gates Fund or the Buffett Fund can actually determine what the world priorities are and so distort what the priorities should be for public health, because it's tied to the economics, the need to industrialize, the need to medicalize, and the need to pharmaceuticalize. But there's a big backlash coming, a big backlash in the Western world, much more critical thought about the efficacy and the safety and the appropriateness of the drugs and vaccines and medications. And this group is beginning to be more and more articulate and more concerned. But one of the big problems is that because of this huge amount of money that the Bill and Melinda Gates Fund have, is that the technicians like myself, the public health tribes, have been captured because their success is predicated upon getting jobs or research tied to the interests of the Global Fund. So the critical thought is being hollowed out, and so at the same time are the essential public health functions, because public health is there, as Ibsen would say, to be the enemy of the people, but actually it's there to be critical, to appraise and to think rationally, and to remind everybody about what the social determinants of health are. And it's not rocket science. It doesn't need magic potions or millions of dollars spent on genetics and laboratories. It needs very, very basic things, but they are essential because they're what the public health infrastructure is built on.
Contrast this, what's going on in the bulk of the world, with a tiny country like Cuba, which has managed to construct a public health system, which is precisely many things that you're arguing for. It's very oriented to preventive medicines which stop a disease from spreading, which catch it at the right moment, and which has now amongst the best record of public health services and its effects in terms of what Cuban citizens, and increasingly because of the help they've given Venezuela, Venezuelan citizens and other South American citizens who never used to have health, are now in much better shape than many people, for instance, in Eastern Europe, which went in for big privatizations, leave alone Africa and large parts of Asia. You've studied the system, I think.
Well, yes, I think the Cuba's system is very inspiring, and anybody who's been to Cuba can't but feel the public health benefits of it. I mean, they are a country which really know the meaning of austerity, and yet their GDP, which is the equivalent of many of these very poor countries, but they don't have this extraordinary inequalities because their vision and campaign has been around public health and health for all. So they've done extraordinarily well and quite remarkably well. I mean, the real problem comes is what's happening now. And will they get sidetracked by neoliberal policies, and they need to get drugs to market and they need to sell drugs? It's a very important time for Cuba to think about it. But actually they need to all the time be remembering what their GDP is and what they've achieved with their GDP compared with some of these poorest countries in the world, like Sierra Leone and Liberia especially.
The other thing, of course, is that the Cubans have sent out a lot of their doctors to parts of Africa, South America, whenever there's a disaster. I remember during bad floods in Pakistan, really bad, a whole team of Cuban doctors arrived and were taken to the remotest parts of the country where women were not allowed by their menfolk to see doctors because most doctors were male. And when they saw the Cuban team, which was 60% women and 40% male doctors, the men in these communities said, "Oh, you have women doctors, you're doctors?" And they said, yes, yes. They said, "Okay, you can see the women whenever you want." So an amazing rapport developed between them. And the women were very pleased, and so were their kids. And a Cuban doctor told me that they said to us, "Where do you come from, you people?" And she said, "We come from Cuba." "Where is that?" And she said, "It's a tiny island in the Caribbean." And they said, "Who is your leader? I mean, what is the government?" So they were careful because they were on a medical mission, but they said, "Do you want to see a picture of Fidel Castro, who is our leader?" And said, "Yes." So they showed a picture of Castro. And the women said, "My God, he's got a beard like they have in that village 20 miles from here. Do you want to go and see those beards?" But they were incredibly impressed, and the entire media in Pakistan was talking about what they'd done. They said, "We don't want any help from the government. We arrive with our tents, our equipment. All we want is receptacles in which we can heat clean water, and the rest we'll do. We'll bring our medicines with us." And the thing is, this is the other point which rises, that unlike the health services constructed in Western Europe after the Second World War, including the National Health Service, the governments in these countries never actually set up pharmaceutical industries to complement those health services. Nor did they even seriously consider nationalizing them, because that would have brought the prices of medicine right down, and they need never have charged prescriptions. So let's come for a minute to a subject you know very well, the health service in Britain and in the European Union countries. I mean, what is happening to that, Alison? It's one thing to talk about Africa, but what is happening to the health services in Europe?
What's happening now in Europe, as many people are aware, is that we've got we've got neoliberal policies coming from the US, both the healthcare industry in the US, which have exhausted the funds of America because healthcare is running at about 18% of GDP, compared with 9 or 10% average in Europe. So the European healthcare investors need to find new markets, and they're busy attempting to penetrate and open up the healthcare systems of Europe. And of course, the biggest trophy for them is the United Kingdom NHS, because it was for a long time the most socialised of all the healthcare systems. So we've had devolution, so Scotland, Wales and England all have their own healthcare services, and Scotland and Wales, which are very tiny, they don't cover more than 8 or 9 million people, they've retained a national health service. But England, which many people don't realise this, England abolished its national health service in 2012 with the Health and Social Care Act. What remains of the NHS is a funding stream or a government payer, and the NHS is now being reduced to a logo, and what the government is now doing is accelerating the breakup of what remains of the National Health Service under public ownership, so closing hospitals, closing services, and privatising or contracting out. So just as we heard in Liberia and Guinea about how public lands are being transferred, like the enclosures, to private owners from abroad, the same thing is happening with our public services. Our public hospitals, our public facilities are also being enclosed in a way and given over to private for-profit investors. And this is happening at extraordinary speed in England, faster than anywhere in Europe. And this is a major global neoliberal project, if you like.
To privatise health.
To privatise not just the healthcare system, but also ultimately the funding. Now, in the US, just under half of that 18% GDP is actually paid for by the government. But the government is in effect a taxpayer and then channels the money into private for-profit corporations. The government in England abolished the Health and Social Care Act because it wanted to open up new funding streams. So it wants to reduce the level of services that are available publicly, create a climate of discontent with the NHS, forcing people who are in the middle classes, that's like you and me, Ali, to go and privately and pay either out of pocket or with our healthcare insurance, so that we exit what's left. But at the same time, the government is reducing all our entitlements because there's no longer a duty to provide universal healthcare. That duty that's been in place since 1948 was abolished in 2012. So that duty is now gone. And so now the government can reduce all the entitlements, reduce everything that's available, and increasingly we're going to have to pay out of pocket or through private health insurance. And the private health insurance industry are here. They're here from the US, and they're absolutely gearing up with the new structures the government's put in place to move into private for-profit health insurance. That's what we're going to be seeing. And actually the new system the government's putting in place is modelled on the US. And yet that will come at huge loss, and it will also be a public health catastrophe, because it will mean that many, many millions will increasingly go without care. And of course, markets render people invisible. They're not seen. Nobody knows. The doctor in front of you only sees the patients that come to them. It doesn't see the many tens of thousands who are being denied access to healthcare, which is why in the US the doctors are not out on the street campaigning. But in the UK, the doctors are out on the street campaigning. They're standing now for the new National Health Alliance Party. They're now putting in candidates to stand against the conventional parties. And so you see that the doctors are still prepared to fight for universal healthcare. But once our NHS has gone completely, it's been abolished, but once all the remnants have gone, you have to use the parallel of the oak tree. It seems to be blooming and flourishing, but the roots have been severed. And that can take many months or years for that to completely decay. But once it's gone, then the doctors will no longer be there. They'll be like the doctors in the US, interested in themselves, interested in their own pockets, and not interested in universal access to healthcare. And this is the crime of this century, if you like, the way in which the English coalition, both Conservative and Liberal Democrat, have actually abolished our NHS, but they had a lot of help along the way from the Labour government before them.
Exactly. Labour more or less set the basis for it when they were in power.
Absolutely. Alan Milburn in 2000. In 1997, the Labour government had its chance to reverse the privatisation and marketisation policies, to get rid of the private finance initiative. And they had a very good Secretary of State who was quite determined to do some of that, Frank Dobson. But they got rid of him extra quick, and instead of which we got Alan Milburn and his 10-year plan. And now he's gone off to join the very healthcare companies that he helped to build up. And I mean, I think that's the tragedy, is when that bill was going through Parliament to abolish the NHS, many of the peers and many of the MPs had conflicts of interest because they had actually interests in the healthcare companies that they were establishing.
It's outrageous, really.
Well, it's a travesty for democracy. It really is. And as a public health doctor, it is an absolute catastrophe, because at the moment we know people of all ages with serious mental illnesses who cannot get access to healthcare, people with stroke, people with chronic illnesses, chronic diseases, who are increasingly being denied access to healthcare. And they are voices in the wilderness. They are not being heard because there is no collective mechanism for them to be heard anymore. And the doctors and nurses are absolutely in despair. Now, we do have a solution. My colleagues and I, we've written an NHS reinstatement bill, which we hope that whichever party comes to power, they will actually run with to reinstate the NHS. So there is a solution out there, which is drafted and written and ready, that would restore and reinstate the NHS in England.
Alison, France and Germany, the two other big countries, their health services?
Well, France and Germany are doing similar things, but actually there are more checks and balances there. Partly because of employer-employee representation and trade unions. But actually, you cannot think that the rest of Europe is safe either. There are more checks there going on, but some of this privatisation is also taking place.
Because it is a sort of intense globalisation program.
It is. And it's driven
that,
by...
you know, it's perfectly legitimate to make profits from the needs of people.
Yes, from people's diseases and from people's illnesses. Well, it began with the pharmaceutical industry and the vaccine production. It's perfectly acceptable to make profits from them. So why shouldn't we now go on and make profits from illness and care? But of course, the NHS in England was set up to be redistributive. It's funded through taxation, which is meant to be progressive, and the money is meant to flow according to need. But what we're now beginning to see is that money will flow according to the needs of shareholders and not patients, and that's a very real concern.
Alison, thank you very much. It's a sad story, but it's real and it needs to be fought against, and you're one of the people fighting against it, for which many thanks. And I think it's a lesson that needs to be studied, because it can be reversed, as you pointed out.
It's all down to political will. Everything can be reversed, but it comes down to politics, democracy, and people making their voices heard.
Thank you very much.